Ever get that feeling like you're trying to wrap your head around all the big, crazy stuff happening in the world right now?
Oh yeah, totally. Feels like things are changing faster than ever.
Exactly. And that's kind of the feeling I got watching this YouTube video, Europa Atsunyata I Asukanawija live.
Europe, isolated and deceived live vision. Catchy, right?
Definitely grabs your attention. So that's what we're diving into today. This guy, Krzysztof Jackowski, he's got this YouTube channel, JASNOWIDZ Krzysztof Jackowski Official.
And he does these live streams, kind of lays out his view of what's going on, geopolitically, economically, all that.
Yeah, and this particular one, he was a little late starting, like almost half a minute, blamed it on work. Starts off real casual, saying hi to folks in the chat, Koala, Koloe, Isabella, Patrick. But then he jumps right into some pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
So for this deep dive, our mission, if you will, is to unpack all that. What are the key takeaways? How does he see all these global pieces fitting together? Especially, what's his take on Europe's situation right now?
Well, he definitely doesn't sugarcoat it. Straight up says America has abandoned allies and is all about its own interests now, especially with trade, working hand in hand with Israel. You get the sense Europe's kind of left out in the cold.
Interesting how he ties that to Trump. Suggests Trump's going to make a move, start an economic war to trigger a crisis. Now, what exactly does that mean?
Yeah, good point. Tariffs, trade wars, something else entirely.
Got to keep that in mind as we go through his thinking. But then he goes even further, throws out this warning about the dollar and the euro. Says they're not going to be stable for much longer.
Yeah, it tells people not to put all their eggs in those baskets, so to speak. Kind of implies America's playing the long game here, waiting for things to crash.
Which plays right into that whole idea of America looking out for number one, even if it means others take a hit. And then there's his view of Europe itself, calls it weak within itself.
Even says he understands why someone like Trump would have a grudge against Europe. Kind of harsh, coming from a European voice, you know?
It is. But maybe he sees some real internal problems, divisions that make Europe less reliable, more vulnerable to outside pressure, which might explain why he thinks the U.S. is shifting focus. Speaking of focus, let's shift ours to the Middle East. That's a big part of his analysis.
Oh yeah, right away he drops this bombshell. Says Israel started another war overnight, claims over 400 dead in Gaza, starts the whole Middle East discussion off with a bang, literally.
Whoa. That's a huge claim right off the bat. Immediately sets the scene, lots of tension, things escalating quickly. And then there's how he sees Trump and Putin. Uses the word betrayal. Strong word.
Yeah, definitely implies some serious deception, broken trust going on there. And his warnings just keep getting more intense. Says if Israel doesn't back off, and he mentions some gentleman involved, something about rumors online of moving family, but he dismisses that for himself. If Israel doesn't stop, and if Iran gets attacked, could be April, May, September, he thinks World War III.
Wow. Talk about a dire prediction. He goes on to say Iran's got this large defensive arsenal. He even claims it'll surprise Israel. Like, they're more ready than people think.
And he doesn't stop there. Says if Iran gets hit, Russia, Turkey, China, they'll all back Iran up.
So he's painting this picture of a huge global conflict, all stemming from the Middle East. And it's not just talk. He says Iran will hit back, attack American bases directly.
So according to him, it's not a question of if, but when. And the stakes, well, they couldn't be higher. Now, what about Trump and Putin? He seems to have a pretty unique take on their relationship.
Yeah, completely different from what you usually hear. Says Putin doesn't trust Trump, even despises him a bit. Thinks Putin sees right through his games.
And get this, he thinks Russia saw Trump's actions in Ukraine, not as a power play, but as America humiliating itself.
Huh, that's an interesting angle. Really makes you think about how Russia views its own place on the world stage, their motives.
Then he brings up this thing about Trump wanting to create a whole new global currency, something to rival a future BRICS currency.
Right, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. There's been talk about them cooking up their own alternative to the dollar. Big implications for global finance if that happens.
For sure. And speaking of implications, he thinks Trump leaning on Europe, what with their military not being so strong, that could backfire big time if Putin flips the script.
Especially if trust in America is already shaky. Could push former allies right into Russia's arms. Talk about shifting power dynamics. So what about Europe? How does all this impact them?
Well, he thinks if a war with Iran kicks off, the UK is going to step up, offer military support.
Makes sense, given their history and current alliances.
But he also thinks there's going to be huge panic across Europe if that happens, especially with everything already going on in Ukraine.
Double whammy of anxiety. And remember how he said Russia might betray the U.S.? Well, he adds to that, says they might close their borders, try to keep unrest and migration under control.
Sounds like he's worried about the whole continent becoming unstable. Specifically mentions Poland thinks they'll be hit hard by panic.
Especially the men, facing possible conscription. But he does say even if they get called up, they might not see combat right away, more like a strategic move. Now, what about China? Where do they fit into all this?
He's noticed they've been pretty quiet, especially with Ukraine and what he calls the genocide in the Middle East. Thinks Western media is not covering that enough.
Interesting.
But he thinks China's waiting in the wings. If Iran lays down the law for the U.S., he thinks China will step in, not militarily, but definitely make their presence known.
So more of a behind-the-scenes power play, economic pressure, diplomacy, that sort of thing. But it all hinges on what Iran demands. Now, let's get into the financial side of things. He talks about the World Bank, specifically Ajay Banga, the president.
Yeah, mentions his background, how he's been a U.S. citizen since 2007. And get this, he says he's got a feeling that 2 new international currencies are about to get approved, but someone's holding them back. And he's worried about all the major currencies, how stable they really are.
Doesn't exactly paint a rosy picture, does it?
Not at all. And here's the kicker. He thinks Bunga's just a puppet. Says the real power's somewhere else, pulling the strings. And he's not buying all the positive talk about the Polish stock market and the zloty being strong against the dollar.
Yeah, he thinks the dollar's weaker than people realize, and the zloty's strength is just a temporary illusion. Doesn't have much faith in those numbers.
Nope. Oh, and he briefly mentions Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank, throws out her birth year, nationality.
Just to set the scene, I guess, remind us who the major players are in the financial world. Now, amidst all this doom and gloom, someone in the chat asked a pretty important question. How do you prepare for all this, if things really go south?
Right. And he admits it's tough to pinpoint the exact moment everything falls apart. Plus, you get kind of numb to it all after a while. Like, he mentions the deaths in Gaza. It's horrible, but it's become almost a daily occurrence, so the shock wears off.
I get that. Constant bad news can make it hard to stay engaged, even when it's really serious stuff. But he doesn't really offer any concrete advice for prepping, does he?
Not really. It just emphasizes that the world's becoming a very unstable place. And then he drops this other bombshell. Says Europe's secretly working on a law, something about emergency financial reserves for citizens.
What, like tapping into people's savings?
Sounds like it. Thinks they're expecting a huge crash, government budgets going bust, so they need a way to cover the shortfall.
Yikes. Talk about a controversial move.
Yeah.
And then he brings up the IMF, the International Monetary Fund.
Right. Says he had a vision about it, something happening in June, but he admits his timing's not always accurate. In this vision, the IMF gets torn apart. Now, just so everyone's on the same page, the IMF is part of the UN, and they're all about global financial stability, helping countries trade, grow their economies, reduce poverty, all that.
So him saying the IMF gets torn apart, that implies a major breakdown of the entire global financial system.
Exactly. And he goes on to say, at first it'll seem like everyone's dirt poor, but then things will settle into a more modest way of life. Makes it sound like that initial fear of poverty is part of the plan, a way to control people during the crisis.
Interesting.
And lastly, he says it'll all happen so fast, nobody will have time to protest or fight back. Just rapid, overwhelming change.
So, to sum up our deep dive here, this guy's painting a pretty bleak picture. Europe's isolated, America's playing a dangerous game, the Middle East is a tinderbox, and the global financial system's on the verge of collapse.
And don't forget the potential for shifting alliances, Russia and China waiting to make their move. Definitely a lot to think about.
It is. So we've laid out his key insights, given you a concentrated dose of his worldview. Now, it's up to you to decide what you make of it all. But here's a final thought to chew on. If he's right about institutions like the IMF crumbling and currencies becoming worthless, what other systems, what other strategies might become important in the future? It's a question worth pondering, both for understanding the big picture and figuring out how to navigate a world that could be changing very, very quickly.
Lots to consider.
For sure.
Until next time.
Stay informed.